Today, as we embark on this journey with the very first session, we set the tone for a series of insightful conversations that are bound to ignite our intellectual curiosity and deepen our understanding of economics. Before we begin, let us take a moment to recognize the esteemed individuals who have been instrumental in shaping this initiative and supporting our academic journey. Though they could not join us today, we extend our heartfelt welcome to Reverend Dr. Lijo Thomas, Dean and Director, Christ Deemed to be University, Pune Lavasa Campus, Father Justin P. Varghese, Academic Coordinator, Dr. Jibrail Jose, Associate Dean, Dr. Lija Jacob, Head of Department of Data Science. With them, I would also like to welcome Mr. Naveen Hari, founder of Economiga, Mr. Alan Simon and Mr. Nandu S. Nair, the co-founders of Economiga, whose passion for economics have brought this platform to life. Last but certainly not the least, a very warm welcome to all the students, research fellows, and economic enthusiasts who have joined us from the institutions across this nation. Your presence here is a testament to the curiosity and passion for the field of economics you have. We hope today's session will be both enriching and engaging for all of you. Following the session, there will be a Q&A segment where you can post your questions directly to the professor, and please feel free to jot down your questions during the talk and share them via the chat box. Now, I would like to introduce the speaker of the day. Dr. Agrawal is an adjunct faculty of economics at Ahmedabad University and a visiting faculty at Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics. With a PhD from IIM Bangalore and a significant experience in financial sector, Dr. Agrawal blends academic rigor with practical insights. He is also the creator of the popular blog Mostly Economics, ranked among the top 100 economic blogs globally. Dr. Agrawal's passion for bridging academic concepts with public discourse has shaped how we approach the modern economics. We are truly honored to have him here and look forward to his valuable insights. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Amol Agrawal to begin his session. Over to you, sir.
Good evening to all of you. Thanks a lot to Christ University Lavasa Campus. And I'm obviously slightly unhappy that I couldn't be there Professor Teni had approached and wanted me to be there. And looking at the beautiful pictures of the campus on Google, I'm actually very unhappy that I'm not there, to see the beautiful campus and be there. So hopefully there is a next time. Uh, so, so today's talk, uh, which is today we'll discuss about the economics Nobel Prize 2024, and before we go into the Nobel Prize of 2024, a bit of history. As a student of history, I can't help but bore others with history. Because most of us don't know how economics Nobel Prize actually started. So the Swede entrepreneur, inventor who invented dynamite, Alfred Nobel, he in his will had stated that that from his will prizes will be created to those who have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. He left about 31 million Swedish kroner, or which is about 2.2 billion Swedish kroner today, to fund these prizes. These prizes were invested in safe securities. So way back in 1896, when he passed away, there was a society which decided to award him. The society which decided to get these awards. So in 1901, Nobel Prize began to be awarded in physics, chemistry, medicine, peace, and literature. So you can see that there are these 5 categories of prizes, and today these laureates get this medal and the diploma, along with all that prestige. And but what about the economics Nobel? Does anyone know? Does anyone know how did economics Nobel start? Anyone in the class? Anyone in the audience? Okay. I believe the screen is not moving. Wait a second. Stop sharing. Yeah, okay. I think now it should be okay. There's a problem with the screen sharing. So does anyone know how does the economics Nobel start and why it starts? Yes, no. I mean it'd be useful if some of you can at least answer something. Otherwise, I don't know whether I'm just talking to the. So it started in 1969 on the occasion of 300th anniversary of the Sveriges Riksbank, which is also the central bank of Sweden. So the Central Bank of Sweden, the oldest central bank, started in 1668. It was celebrating its 300th year, and there was a conflict between the finance ministry and the central bank. And there was this discussion about interest rates and so on. And in order to please the finance ministry, in order to please the central bank, this award was instituted. So the Nobel Prize in Economics is not really the original sort of prize as Alfred Nobel had imagined. And to be fair, around the beginning of the 1901, economics as a discipline was still shaping up under Alfred Marshall and so on and so forth. So it was not really a full-fledged discipline by then. Though we had some eminent economists, but Alfred Nobel had no such plans. So this is essentially called as the Sverige Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. So you see the Nobel Prize of Economics, the medal given is different from the medal given to other laureates, right? So which is in memory of Alfred Nobel, given by the Swedish Central Bank. Some facts, we need to do better in terms of women awardees. There have just been 3 so far. And there is a lot of criticism that economics as a profession has not really been gender inclusive. Several women economists have been ignored and so on and so forth. So each time the award is given, this discussion always happens that the profession is not really. And there's a great essay. I'll share these slides. Those who want to understand the Nobel Prize in Economics from 1969 to 2007, on which categories and why certain individuals were given the prize and how they added to the economics knowledge. At the end of the day, economics Nobel Prize is about rewarding or awarding people, awarding economists who have contributed to building economic knowledge. Okay, so now we jump to 2024 Nobel. To whom and for what? It has been given to three individuals: Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. So this is the broad profile of these 3 people: the Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, both at MIT, James Robinson at University of Chicago. And from now on, I'll refer to them as AJR. I mean, you'll see a lot of publications, a lot of social media also referring them as AJR. They are quite a formidable trio. Okay. Now the question is, before we jump to why they were awarded the prize, we need to get some broad understanding of what is it that they're trying to do. So the laureates, the 3 laureates, that they tried to answer the most important question of economics, which is why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. This question, when you start thinking about this question, there is very little else which interests us, because this whole problem of differences in economic development, differences in economic growth, and this whole idea that there are some countries which are rich and others poor, and actually it's not some, there are few countries which are rich and most others are poor. So this question is the most important question of economics. And obviously there are lots of threads to this question. It's a very broad question, because what do you mean by rich, what do you mean by poor, and how do you really go about doing it? And we also, students of economics, understand that in 1776, just as America is getting independence, America is about to get independence. Adam Smith is publishing his classic Inquiry into Nature and Cause of Wealth of Nations, which by the title itself suggests that even Smith during his time was basically interested in this question of what determines the wealth of nations. And this book basically started the Western economic thought as we are as we study in the history of economic thought, and it leads to this deep inquiry into wealth of nations. And Smith looks at multiple reasons for the nature and cause of wealth of nations, but primarily we understand that he was focusing on accumulation of capital, that countries which are able to accumulate capital, and obviously there are many factors, many reasons how and why certain countries accumulate capital. We are not going to Smith. Maybe we can have some more lectures on Adam Smith and his legacy. And even today, as the Nobel citation tells us, the richest 20% of the world countries are around 30 times richer than the poorest 20%. So, fast forwarding to about 250 years, right? So Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is going to celebrate its 250 years in 2026. So even now, things have not changed much. So when Smith is writing this book versus 250 to 250 years later, this question remains that there is a lot of disparity. And the 20%, as you can see, that the 20% rich countries have GDP per capita, which is about 30 times than the 20% poorest countries. That's like a lot of disparity. And moreover, the income gap between the richest and the poorest countries is persistent. So you can trace, now we have a lot of data. Obviously, Angus Madison has given us some historic data. Now, even if you don't believe that data, you have some data which is collected by the World Bank, IMF, etc., of the last 70, 80 years. And whenever you trace that GDP data, you see that there are very few countries who are able to, break the ceiling and move into the developed country status. And most of the others remain poor. And even if the poor countries become richer over a period of time, the gap between the rich and the poor remains. Okay, so and then of late, because of the 2020s, since the 2008 crisis and the pandemic, we are back to discussing this question about countries stuck in low income and middle income trap. The World Bank's World Development Report 2024 gives you a very pessimistic analysis of how countries are constantly stuck into this middle income trap. And for the last 40, 50 years, there are some countries which have not been able to grow. So it's even though Smith wrote about this question remains as relevant. A very interesting example is of North Korea versus South Korea. What explains, and obviously South Korea is in a lot of discussions because of the presidency, because of the emergency which was imposed and then it was taken out. So what explains this divergence between South Korea and North Korea? That South Korea takes off and North Korea, yes, we understand some factors like dictatorship and so on, but what is it about dictatorship that leads to poor growth, and what is it about democracy which leads to better growth, and how is it that these two countries diverge so much? Likewise, Acemoglu and so on, the AJR have lots of case studies. All right. Another very interesting example, which I will come back to later, is this place called Nogales, which is bordering, as you can see this map, and this is the US map, this is the Mexico map, and this place Nogales is basically between the divided between the two boundaries. But when you look at Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, US, it is its residents are relatively well off, have long average lifespans, and most children receive high school diplomas. Whereas when you look at the Nogales in Mexico, it looks very poor, right? So it's not just about looking at countries from some countries which are very different. So we are not looking at Africa and United States. We are not looking at Africa and South Asia. We are not looking at North America and South Asia. We are basically, when we look at very nearby regions, when we look at South Korea, North Korea, which are just divided across the boundaries, how is it that it starts to differ so much? Likewise, this case of Nogales, Mexico versus Nogales, US, how is it that those in US side are happier, they have higher per capita incomes, they have better standard of living, they have more protection of police, they have all kinds of things. Whereas Nogales and Sonara, which is just, you know, it's like you take one step here, you take another step here, and the differences are very wide. Okay, so what explains the difference, right? So whether you look at wealth of nations across different geographies, or you look at wealth of nations across a very similar geography, or regions across similar geographies, these discrepancies are very large, and it's been a big puzzle, right? And economists obviously have been interested since Smith's time. Multiple factors have been cited. Geography has been one factor. That when you look at this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, by Jared Diamond, he points out how the European countries, are in this belt of temperate climate, and as a result, the temperate climate has, more productivity and so on and so forth, and those are regions which have, higher growth. They have lesser disease burden, whereas when you look at tropical regions, they have, more problematic. They have a lot of heat, and that's where climate change and some of those things are becoming very important, because suddenly Europe is becoming as hot as Africa and some other places. Religion and culture. Some, like Weber, pointed out that Protestant Reformation basically led to roots of industrial revolution in regions which have Protestant Reformation. Trust, that lack of trust in society leads to this kind of development. And then you have factor endowments, that some regions have better factor endowments, as discussed in this literature. And then Solo's research, which points out that difference in the saving rates, which is similar to Adam Smith's telling you about accumulation of capital, leads to differences in growth. So economists have been interested in this question ever since Smith's time, and they have come across multiple factors. Now the question is, how does institutions fit in, right? And that's what we are. But before we go to Acemoglu, we need some broad understanding of. So over in the last few years, there has been a lot of interest in institutions, and institutions have become seen as a very uh, important way. And even Smith, Mill, and several other scholars have written about institutions. But it is just that we didn't really start defining them properly. Douglas North, as this picture suggests, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for showing institutions matter to economic growth. And North defined institutions as humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. So basically, it's important to understand a couple of things. That firstly, they're humanly devised constraints, right? So it is not something which gods have given us. It is not something which nature has given us. It is humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. Okay, so uh, everything basically encompasses institutions. These are humanly devised constraints. And then he further says that institutions comprise both informal constraints and formal constraints. Formal rules are constitutions, laws, property rights. Informal constraints are sanctions, taboos, customs, traditions, codes of conduct. So there is a possibility that formal rules are leading to economic development, but informal constraints don't allow you to. Formal rules might say that women can work, but informal constraints will say that women can't work out of households, because those traditions and customs don't allow women to work. So you need both the formal and the informal institutions to kind of lead to economic development. And then he basically points out to this large history that institutions have evolved incrementally, connecting the past to the present and the future, and they are they define the choice set that determines transactions and provide incentives to an economy. So based on the institutional setup of a country, the institutions are these constraints, institutions are these formal rules. These formal rules in turn lead to the economic destiny of the country, depending on how those institutions are organized and how you set up those institutions. Am I making sense? Are you guys understanding what I'm saying? Am I going too fast, too slow? Any feedback so far?
Sir, you're good to go.
Okay. So then North also tells us about the difference between institutions and organizations. And he says that institutions are the rules of the game, and organizations and their entrepreneurs are players of the game. So just all this while neoclassical economics, which evolves after the classical economics, neoclassical economics is the marginal revolution. It is not very careful about institutions. They don't really care much about the role of institutions. So after the classical school, which was focusing on the institutions, the neoclassical comes in and they are not looking at all these things. And then the institutionalists come in who point out that economic development is a combination of organizations and their entrepreneurs, or sorry, organizations and institutions. Okay, the neoclassical school mainly focuses on organizations. It forgets institutions, and the so that's also important to understand that the historiography of economic thought. So organizations are made up of group of individuals bound together by some common purpose to achieve certain objectives. Organizations include political bodies, economic bodies, educational bodies, and all these different entities which the institutions create. So you have a constitution of India. The constitution of India allows you to set up these various organizations, including the political bodies, which are the political parties, city council, regulatory bodies, economic bodies. So the North, if you read Douglas North, he's all the time very careful about classifying institutions and organizations differently. Okay, but today we kind of put both these categories together. I mean, we call RBI as an institution, whereas as far as North is concerned, RBI as a regulatory body is an organization. Institutions are much broader. They are the larger rules, the larger conduct of the society, and in which different organizations come up, they compete, and they sort of do things. And the better framed the institutions are, the lower would be the transaction costs of functioning. And that's the whole way in which these institutionalists look at economic development. Okay. So the institutional framework, if it rewards piracy, then piratical organizations will come in. If the institutional framework rewards productive activities, then those productive activities. So it's very important that the rule of the law and the social norms, the formal rules, they are set up in ways in which economic development and basic societal development happens, and the incentives they'll align, incentives they develop leads to broader economic development. So we've already discussed that historically many scholars and economists have cited institutions as a reason for development. And with North's literature and with North's ideas coming in, and availability of data, see, as we will argue, institutions are not something which are established today. They go back in time. So if I have to understand the impact of the Indian Constitution on India's economic development, then I need to really go back to the constitutional debates, understand them, and so on and so forth, and trace economic development. So it's not something which is happening today. It's happened way back in the past. And even the Indian Constitution will go back to the 1935 Act. The 1935 Act in turn will go back to the British parliamentary debate. So it's a very incremental, long-driven process. And economists, the modern economists who are looking at data, so as digitization happens, as these things, libraries become more accessible, archives start coming in, you have lots of studies in the 1990s which start looking at institutions of different kinds. So you see that Knack and Kiefer looked at property rights enforcement, which is some sort of an institution that countries which have better property right enforcement will lead to more economic development. Morrow 1995 paper looks at corruption. Yankov et al. Compiled measures of entry barriers across countries. Then this research, La Porta, Rafael Lopez, Schliefer, Vishny, which is also called as LLSV research based on their last surnames. They also look at many things, and one of the things which they look at is common law versus civil law. That countries which had common law, the British common law, and the countries which had French civil law, you see different developments in these things. So as this data starts becoming more available from historical political scientists and several other people who make this data, and the economists then grapple with this data and try and find out. So in all this big question, we've had multiple stories of trying to understand why US is rich, why Africa is poor, and institutions have become an important component of explaining this discussion. Okay, adding to this discussion that apart from geography, apart from culture, apart from uh, other things, institutions also matter. And because of the fact that it has becomes relatively easier to get data, so you can develop data sets and call these things institutions, and then trace whether this institution led to better development or not. All that. Okay. Now we come to the AJR contribution. Okay. So I've already realized that I've already ran out of time. I mean, I'm just okay, because this background is important. Otherwise, we can't understand what Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson have kind of done. So Acemoglu build on this approach that institutions matter to economic development, and they tell us that there are two broad institutions: political institutions, economic institutions. Political institutions are political rules of the game, democracy versus dictatorship, electoral laws, constraints, etc. Economic institutions are the economic rules of the game, property rights, contracting institutions, etc. And in economics, we are mainly concerned with economic institutions as they drive economic development. But what drives economic institutions? It is, as far as AJR are concerned, it is political institutions which drive economic institutions. Okay, so that is really their key contribution. That firstly, uh, they add to this whole literature of institutions matter, and then they classify it across two broad institution categories, political and economic. And they basically go on to say that unlike other economists who were not really very carefully looking at political institutions, they point out that it's basically political institutions which lead to economic institutions, and that's what leads to the growth. So what is the Acemoglu, the AJR framework? So as you can see, that it has three building blocks. It has got these political institutions which give you this political power. I'll explain that, which leads to economic institutions at time t, and also lead to political institutions at time t plus one. And these economic institutions in turn leads to economic performance and distribution of resources in time t and time t plus one. Okay, so this is their sort of broad framework under which they work. Okay, now what does it mean? So I've divided this into three building blocks, as I say here. So the first building block is that economic institutions lead to economic growth and distribution. What does it mean? It means that economic institutions matter for economic growth. They are the ones which influence investments in physical and human capital and technology and the organization of production, right? So ultimately, it is the economic policy of the government, economic policy uh, of the RBI, and so on, which lead to economic framework. Likewise, policies of state governments, several other actors, and they lead to broad rule of law, broad rule of economic law, and which leads to this investments in physical and human capital. And then it also determines distribution of economic resources in the future. So economics is about two things: production and distribution. So what Acemoglu, AJR are saying is that economic institutions lead to both economic performance and distribution of resources. That ultimately, whatever we produce, it has to be distributed to. So that is economic institutions, they do it. Now it's like peeling the onion, like all researchers do. But then the question is, what is then leading to economic institutions? I mean, how do we understand, are economic institutions something which fall from the tree? No, right? So there's something which must be leading to economic institutions. So the second building block is that economic institutions in turn are determined endogenously as collective choices of society, in large part for their economic consequences. However, different economic institutions lead to different distribution of resources, right? So I can, so what you're arguing here is that economic institutions, to decide whether India needs to be a developed country by 2047, it is that's the larger goal we have. But to achieve that larger goal, you will have economic institutions. But so that's the production bit. But how will you decide on distribution of resources, right? Whether you need to create wealth at the top, or you need to distribute wealth, right? So this policy is been there. I mean, this was a top question in 1947. This was a top question in 1991. This is a top question today. And every country has faced this problem that how do you distribute resources? Okay, so what they're arguing is that uh, the economic institutions in turn are shaped by political power, and people have uh, there are two groups. One group, I mean, whichever has more political power. So there could be one group which prefers inclusive growth. There's another group which prefers growth at the top, which trickles down. Now, whichever group will have more power, right? So one can argue that 47 we had, uh, you know, a lot of the government power was driven by the fact that resources have to be distributed. So we had a socialist sort of model in 1991 that started drifting towards more capitalist kind of a model, and gradually the political power shifted from from a socialist model to a more capitalist model. Okay, so which group has more political power is likely to secure the set of economic institution that it prefers. So political power, first thing, economic institutions. Economic institutions lead to economic performance. Then you are saying political power across the groups lead to economic institutions. Okay. Now the question is, what is leading to political power, right? So they are saying that there are two components of political power: de jure political power, de facto political power. De jure political power refers to power that originates from political institutions in society. And political institutions determine the constituents and incentives of the political sphere. Examples of political institutions include the form of government, for example, democracy versus dictatorship or autocracy. So ultimately, uh, economic institutions will be shaped by political power. Political power, in turn, is shaped by political institutions. All right. And political institutions of whatever government you form, whatever kind of political system you have, it will give de jure political power to the legislative, and the legislative in turn, legislative, judiciary, they will collectively, come up with these political institutions, and these political institutions will give the political power to the, uh, to these, to the government to work on economic policy. Okay, so there is de jure political power and there is de facto political power. Now, de facto political power is very important. Now you can have countries. I mean, we have these countries where uh, there's a group of people who may not have actual power as given by law, but they nonetheless possess political power. They can revolt, they can use arms, they can hire mercenaries, co-opt the military. So all these countries, which, like, you can take the case of Myanmar, you can take the case of Sri Lanka civil war, right? I mean, all these wars which have happened in Africa and so on, civil wars, they are typically done by people who may not have de jure political power, but they have de facto political power. And because they're not happy with the distribution of resources, they're not happy with the state of affairs, and so they start revolting. And obviously, you can't form a de facto political power till you don't have certain resources, right? You need weapons, you need resources to. So distribution of resources in turn leads to de facto political power. Okay, so okay, uh, and then this political power at time t also leads to political institutions in time t plus one, right? So depending on the combination between de jure and de facto political power, you set up a democracy today. Uh, it will lead to democracy tomorrow, hopefully, right? So that's the whole idea. And obviously, you can have a dictatorship where political power is with the dictator, the de jure political power, but the de facto folks may not be happy, and they might, try and change the thing. So in that case, the political power will change, and you will have political institutions in time t plus one, which could be different from political institutions at time t. Are you guys understanding what I'm saying? I'm not sure whether are you guys are we in sync? Only Niranjan is awake. Uh, Others sleeping. Okay. So we bring this back again. That this is their model of broadly looking at the that you have these political institutions at time t, distribution of resources at time t. They together influence de jure political power and de facto political power. And then this political power leads to economic institutions. It also leads to political institutions at time t+1. And economic institutions lead to economic performance and distribution of resources. So it's important that this de jure and de facto are important here, because let's say you have a dictatorship here where the power lies with the dictator, as I was saying, and the de facto is very submissive, but then gradually de facto becomes powerful. It throws the de jure political power of dictatorship to democracy. So political institutions at time t will differ from political institutions at time t+1. In most of the cases, political institutions at time t will be similar to political institutions at time t+1, which means that the system sort of goes in some sort of a linear way. But you can have transitions of power from t to t+1, which will mean that this political institutions at the new t will be different. So from a dictatorship to a democracy, obviously the power structures and all that change, which will lead to change in economic institutions. So what you also understand is that these things take a lot of time. I mean, there's a reason why uh, this exercise of figuring out institutions is something which you can't, just plug in data of 2024 or 2020, 21 and say that 2024 is because of some things which have been done in 2022, 23, right? You have to go way back in time, and that's where the challenges are. So economists have known, at least the classical school knew that institutions matter, but they didn't really have the data, statistics, and so on. Those fields had not developed by then. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, the fields of statistics, computers, and so on and so forth develop. A lot of archives start to open up, and that's where you can go back in time and argue why certain regions developed certain political institutions and how they ended up having these economic institutions and how these economic institutions explain the performance today and how that explains the wealth of nations, the difference between wealth of nations today and tomorrow. Okay, I'm skipping this. So given the framework, given this broad framework, how do we show it empirically? All this while we've been talking in stories that, okay, this is how Acemoglu's model is. But obviously you don't get a Nobel Prize by simply saying something. You have to prove it. So their challenge was, how do you prove it, right? So this is their most famous paper, Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, where they go back to colonization. And so what they say is that the major reason for the differences in prosperity is the political and economic institutions that the colonizers introduced or chose to retain from the 16th century onwards. So basically they argue that Europeans established two kinds of institutions: inclusive, where there was rule of law and property rights, and extractive, which just extracted resources to serve the homeland. So when you look at the world map and you look at the colonization project, you will see that the European, whether it's the British, the French, they set up colonies everywhere. And what they argue is that these colonizers basically set up two kinds of institutions: inclusive and extractive. Inclusive is where rule of law and property rights exist. Extractive is that they were just simply extracting resources to serve the homeland. So the places where they established inclusive institutions prospered, and where they established extractive institutions not just declined but also had reversal of fortune. And according to them, that is what explains the wealth of nations. Okay, so if I'm looking at America today versus I'm looking at Africa today, American GDP has gone up. America was obviously colonized by British, and when you typically pick up another British colony in Africa and you compare these two, you will see that their per capita GDP is very different, right? So one can argue America is a developed country and this African country is not a developed country. But then what explains it, according to them, what explains is that the British set up more inclusive institutions in America, and we will discuss why, and it set up more extractive institutions in this African country. Okay. Now what explains? I mean, when I am setting up a colony, the AJR cite two major reasons of setting up these two institutions. So first reason is population. So regions have two kinds of population. Either you have large indigenous population or you have sparse population. So wherever you have large indigenous population, you would say that you will expect a lot of resistance. people will resist you. So you will have to work very hard and invest in their homeland. In turn, this led to demands for political rights that gave them a share of profits. Right. So whenever you have large indigenous population, you will have to come and set up inclusive institutions. Why? Because the population will otherwise object. The indigenous population will object. So you will have to basically work in a way which is relatively more cohesive and not as dominating. Then we come to whenever it's sparse population, there is very little population, so there'll be less resistance. So you can just set up extractive institutions where you just say that the leader of the community will get profits, rest I will take it away. So there are no elections and political rights. And so typically, one way to argue is that there was some bit of indigenous population in the United States, a larger one which where there was larger resistance. So you set up institutions which are more inclusive, whereas Africa uh, was uh, didn't have so much population. And the second reason is settler mortality, which explains why certain regions are more populated than the other. So basically, another thing is that in Africa, the tropical region, you have disease prevalence. Disease prevalence is very high, right? You have all these mosquitoes, you have yellow fever, all these diseases which came and killed a lot of people. So wherever you have high disease prevalence, you will set up extractive institutions because people don't want to settle there. Whereas wherever you have lesser disease prevalence, like New Zealand, United States, and so on, Australia, you will set up uh, more inclusive institutions. Why? Because the whites, the Europeans will want to settle in regions which have lesser disease prevalence. So obviously, African, since most of them are tropical countries, the disease prevalence, because forests and so on and so forth, are very high. Likewise, population was sparse, so it made sense to set up extractive institutions in Africa, and it made sense to set up inclusive institutions in Australia and New Zealand. And in India's case, obviously, diseases, though we had large population, uh, but then which meant inclusive institutions have been set up. So we did have laws and so on and so forth compared to other countries. But at the same time, since the disease prevalence was high here, there was also extractive institutions at work. So it's not really a very neat thing that you only set up, you have either this or this. You will also have combinations of uh, large indigenous population and low and high mortality, which will lead to different institutions being set up. Okay, so two reasons: population density and settler mortality basically determine what kind of institutions you're going to set up. So this, obviously, you're going way back in time in the 1600s, and you are trying to find out, okay, where did you set up these things? What was the mortality like, and what is the population like? And then through the research, they're able to show and demonstrate that countries which set up these things back then are the countries which are still prosperous. Okay, so when you look at settler mortality and institutions, right? So you see, this data, you can read the paper. They get this data from very interesting sources. So when you see that wherever you had higher mortality, this is in 1500s. So you can see that there is Mali, there is Nigeria, there is Gambia. These are all African countries where mortality rates are very high. And so you set up extractive institutions here. Whereas Australia, New Zealand, and so on, which had lower mortality, you set up inclusive institutions. And as a result, their GDP per capita is higher. Okay. Likewise, you have settled mortality, and on the y-axis, you have protection against expropriation. So wherever you had higher mortality, you set up institutions which were expropriating wealth. You would just want to take that money, take that wealth, and go back. Right? You are not interested in settling down there. Whereas here, you were okay to settle down because there was lower mortality. Okay, so these are, and you can see that there are different countries, and the paper gives us some more insights as to mortality estimate from various estimates. So you see most of these African countries, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Angola, all of them have very high mortality. Whereas, I mean, India also has about 48.63, and different parts of India have different mortality, whereas most African countries you see have very high mortality. And as a result, most African countries have very high extractive institutions, which continue to remain. I mean, if you read Economist, you will keep seeing that Africa keeps having these leaders who amass all the wealth and never give anything to people. And they keep coming back. Uh, they keep coming to power saying that we are from the hinterlands. Sorry, we are from the population, local population. This leader will do something for us. But the institutions in Africa are such, even today, that they basically only mean wealth for the top. You know, a lot of animal wealth. Sorry, animal farm is what you see in Africa. Whichever the leader, it only, amasses wealth for itself. And what Acemoglu and so on argue is because of this. So what is Acemoglu's explanation of Negol's Mexico and Negol's US? Is that, going, if you look at the geography, you look at the cultures, they're very similar. The only reason why Negol's Mexico and Negol's US are differing is because of the institutions. The British who come to United States, they set up different sort of institutions based on the population density, based on the settler mortality, whereas the Spanish, which set up institutions in Mexico, basically set up extractive institutions because of their own reasons, and that explains why a region which is just cut off by a border, uh, you see growth on one side and you see not, lack of growth on the other side. So you are seeing this happy person here, whereas you are seeing Voldemort's army sort of the Death Eaters sort of thing in the. I hope there are Harry Potter fans here. Are they? Do we have Harry Potter fans here? Yes. No. Okay, so the next important thing which they show is the reversal of fortune. So they're not just able to show that countries which have better inclusive institutions are countries which have higher growth today. They're also able to show that there is reversal of fortune. So you go to Mexico. Mexico at that time is richer than United States at the top. But what you end up doing is, because of the extractive institutions, you take away all their wealth, which means that there is a reversal of fortune. So countries which are rich in 1500 around that period are extremely poor today because of the extractive institutions which have been established in these regions, right? So when you see the reversal of fortune, you see urbanization in 1500, right? Very high in Mexico, as you can see, compared to United States and so on. But because of the extractive institutions which are set up, United States has higher wealth, and there's a reversal of fortune. So countries which are richer, and obviously you don't have GDP, so you are looking at urbanization and population densities as some sort of a proxy for higher development in 1500. And you can see that countries which were more developed in the 1500s are today, in terms of GDP per capita, at a much lower level, whereas countries which were not so developed in 1500s today have much higher. So you have to show it in multiple ways, right? You can't just say that, okay, uh, uh, these countries develop because of inclusive institutions. What you're also showing is that extractive institutions led to reversal of fortune. So that's another very important point. Okay, so then they I think I'm running out of time. I'm already so can I take 10 more minutes?
Yes, sir, you can.
Okay. uh so uh so another important thing is that now we understand that colonization explains, but how do we explain the modern world, right? So we understand that decolonization happened, but post decolonization also we saw that some countries like India developed a democratic system, but many like Africa continued to remain where they were. There have been many attempts to explain democracy. So they also try to explain that uh, countries which have extractive institutions, uh, why will they give up power? Why is it that once you set up a once you move from the colonization to a decolonization project, why is it that the governments do not reverse extractive institutions? See, institutions are humanly created, right? So the colonizers set up extractive institutions, why is it that you continued with the extractive institutions post-independence, right? And why is it that the governments, and that's where I think this Indian experiment is very interesting, because we could have created a very elite government and so on, but I think our founding fathers were some amazing people who reversed all that and created inclusive institutions. I mean, we don't give them the due credits today, but only when you reflect on this sort of history is when you start understanding the challenges they faced. Okay, so obviously over a short run, extractive institutions provide short-term gains for the ruling elite. So the British went away, but the local elite was still there. And local elite understood that, yeah, all these resources are mine. And why do I care? I mean, the British have left me. I'm still the leader. But then they also understand that over a long term, inclusive institutions are important and they benefit everyone, right? So this question also they try and answer, AJR, that why elites don't replace the existing system, right? And so as long as the political system benefits the elites, the population cannot trust that promises of a reformed economic system will be kept. A new political system which allows the population to replace leaders who do not keep their promises in free elections would allow the economic system to be reformed. However, the ruling elites do not believe the population will compensate them for the loss of economic benefits once a new system is in place. This is known as the commitment problem. It is difficult to overcome and means that societies are trapped with extractive institutions, mass poverty, and rich elites. So there is this conflict between the de facto power and the de jure power. The de jure power lies with the government, and the de facto power is with the people, right? I mean, they may not have power, but there is a conversation happening between both of them, and both of them don't trust each other, right? The guys who have de jure power, they will say that, you know, this, if I give power to inclusive institutions, these guys will not compensate me, right? Whereas the guys who have the de facto power, or people who are voting and so on, they don't trust the leader. They think that this leader will come and he will not keep the promises. So this commitment problem basically means that extractive institutions continue, because you will always have the de jure power. uh, de jure will be able to compress, or will be able to overpower the de facto power, okay? Because as a ruler, as a dictator, as somebody who has extractive institutions, I have the police, I have the army, and each time people try and you know want to reverse it, I am simply able to go back and hit them and keep the system as it is, right? Like as we see in Africa, if you read the Economist, these things keep happening all the time. But the interesting thing is that democracy does happen, right? And the democracy in this case only happens when the somehow the de facto power becomes more powerful, all right? And they pose a revolutionary threat, and this threat can include violence. The fact is that revolutionary threat may be greatest if this mobilization is peaceful, because it allows the greatest number of people to join the protest. The elite are faced with a dilemma. When the threat is most acute, they would prefer to stay in power and simply try to placate the masses by promising economic reform, but such a promise is not credible, because the masses know. So it's only when the elites are threatened significantly at the top, that if they don't give up power, there will be a revolution, and the current forces they have are not enough, right? And so to most of these battles of democracy post decolonization have happened with civil wars, and all those sort of things have been very uncomfortable. Whereas in India's case, we kind of did it without yes, there was partition violence, but the process uh, of giving democracy, I mean, where you had universal franchise, people didn't have to fight, all that was fairly peaceful. So what they argue, I'm kind of jumping in, is that they have this beautiful graph that you have this elite here, and there are people who are protesting. So you have three paths. The first path is where nothing happens, because the elite is able to dominate people, and so this play remains an extractive institution. In this, there is a revolution, there are empty promises, there can be constant conflicts between the two, because both are equal. Here, the people's view prevails, and the power is finally handed to become a democracy. All right, and we see even today, countries are constantly grappling with this. There are countries which are where nothing happens; it remains where it is, and then there are countries where people are constantly protesting. We are today seeing, I think protests are constantly breaking out in East European countries and in African countries. But then this conflict is still on, whereas we do see in some countries that there's handover of power. So Botswana is one country which has done beautifully in all the African countries where some of these things happened. Okay, so basically their very messy model explains explains these things. Summing up, colonizers built political institutions based on solid settler mortality and population density, uh, and distribution of resources shape de facto political power. Together, these shape economic institutions which explain economic creation and distribution today. Okay, now there have been a lot of criticisms of this. It's not as if every Nobel laureate, and when these guys wrote the paper in 2001, people had thought at that time that this is a Nobel worthy thing because they had done a very deep dive into the historical analysis. But then people kind of looked at it, and there's this David Elboy paper where he says that Acemoglu's data is not comprehensive, and wherever they don't have data, they simply use similar disease environment. So 36 out of the 2064 countries, they have data of mortality for 28. Other 36 do not have data. And so what they do is they take similar disease environment for the other 36. All right. So that's a statistical thing which they point out. But obviously they had evidence for 28. Now, whether the question is whether you look at 28, you look at 36, and that discussion continues. Then the Schleifer papers have looked at the role of human capital. They basically argue that colonies like Africa did not just get, Canada and Australia did not just get inclusive institutions, but also generally much richer and better educated human capital than native inhabitants. But again, people say that, this is what Acemoglu has been saying, that inclusive institutions lead to better development. So yes, they have not specified human capital, but so all this research, there are all these claims people have made, but I think a very important point here is, and this criticism is valid, is that they somehow glorify colonialism, right? Without really saying it. So you say that, oh, there are these two kinds of institutions, inclusive and extractive, but then even inclusive institutions, were deeply extractive, right? It's not as if Australia and New Zealand, the Maori population of New Zealand, or the Aborigine population in Australia, they were all happy with the inclusive institutions the colonizers gave them, right? We know that Australia was this dumping ground where people were sent as prisoners and so on and so forth. So even if comparatively you have inclusive versus extractive, but inclusive institutions are also deeply extractive. And this imprint of colonialism remains till today. There is a lot of literature, a lot of research, and a lot of pushback by scholars in Africa and so on, that your colonization project basically created a lot of problems. Constant apologies are sought. But this award has opened up this discussion on colonialism, which is a good thing, and a lot of pushback is happening. And one interesting thing is that India, being a democracy, did not generate the economic growth for the 40 years, whereas China, being an autocracy, generated growth for 40 years from 78 before it has slowed down recently. So there was this discussion which happened that, how come India did not generate the kind of economic growth with its inclusive political system, whereas China became an autocracy and China only started generating after 1978. But then Acemoglu, AJR point is that China's growth will not last because China has a deeply extractive, or a political system which is not inclusive. If not extractive, it's a political system which is not inclusive. So they were always of the view that Chinese growth rates will slow down and China will not be able to cope up, and which is what we are seeing today. So because these guys are not looking at growth rates, over 10-year period, 20-year period, they're looking at a very long-term span. So when you're looking at a very long-term span, they were more optimistic that India would be able to do better compared to China over a long period because of its inclusive institutions. So that is something which they stand by. And then there's a follow-up paper by Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer, who looked at the Indian history, and they pointed out that regions which had permanent settlements, where landlords control lands, those are states where economic growth is still slow, whereas wherever you had Ryotwari system, where there was a cultivator, which was a more inclusive system, the growth rates have been higher. So this is not just about leaving it to Europe, but even looking at a deeper dive in India, the Iyer and Banerjee paper gave us these very interesting uh, things. Okay. Conclusion is that inclusive institutions are important, democracy is important, and how historically institutions are formed. They take a long time, and the transition from dictatorship to democracy is a very difficult one. But then countries have gone through it. Some countries are still struggling. Uh, but then they are more hopeful. When you look at geography, when you look at culture, geography and culture are something which you are given by nature, right? I mean, geography especially. That if I am born in Europe, then only I can be rich. But Acemoglu and AJR research tells us that if you can fix the institutions and you make the institutions more inclusive, political institutions followed by economic institutions, you will at least lay path 50 years, 60 years down the line for development. Whereas if you're stuck in geography kind of a debate where geography matters, then you're destined by saying that only when geography changes, when there'll be again some movement on the earth and the geographies are realigned where Africa becomes Europe and Europe becomes Africa, then only there'll be growth. Okay, so they are more, their research gives us more hope, and they have written some very interesting popular books, especially Why Nations Fail, where whatever research I have looked at, they explain that in a very interesting way, and followed by this recent book on technology and this narrow corridor, how nations struggle for liberty. So Acemoglu is one of his kind. As you can see, that his name is there, whether he writes a book with Robinson or he writes a book with Johnson, and an extremely accomplished scholar. And a lot of people say that he can still win 2 or 3 economic Nobel Prizes, going forward. Finally, thank you. I knew this is going to be a long presentation, but I think I have exceeded my time. I'm deeply sorry for that, but I hope uh, I could convey, some things. So over to the audience.
Thank you, Professor Agrawal, for such a fascinating and insightful session. So, as there's a time constraint, we are open only for one question. So, if anyone
Oh
from the
God,
audience has a question, they can raise their hand or post the
I am
question
okay with
directly.
time. If people want to leave, they can leave, but I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I took away 15 minutes. Uh, I mean, I planned, but I don't know. I was timing it. I didn't know how to fit it in 45 minutes. Any questions? Did I make sense, Malvika? I mean,
Yes,
did
sir.
you
Yes.
understand as an undergrad student what I was trying to say?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, Renu,
Thank you, sir, for the
can
presentation.
you switch on your camera? It's
Sir, I just have a very patchy network, so I'm
okay.
scared the audio would also
Okay.
break.
Okay.
So I read about this economist called Yuan Ang. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name
Right.
correctly. She has written. She mainly writes about the Chinese economy, and
Right.
she also had mentioned the puzzle that you had
Right.
mentioned in the slide.
Right.
I was reading one of her articles, and she mentioned how the whole causal relation that the AGR, the trio tries to put forward, right? Where
Mm,
you develop, when you have inclusive institutions, you tend to have growth. So
mm,
she said, she goes on to, she says that even when they went back to Europe, or when you talk about US, when they went and settled over there,
mm.
they also killed a lot of these
Right.
tribals, Red Indians, and all of those, right?
Right.
So when they talk about inclusive institutions, what do they exactly mean?
Mm,
So this was something that she had pointed out. And the second question I had was, so I just wanted to know your thoughts on this.
mm,
The second question that I had was, when we say inclusive institutions, and I had this question, like, when you say democracy, is it taken for granted that it will be an inclusive institution? Because then over a period of time, even the way universal adult franchise, all that happened, right? So it,
Mm.
over a time, the age limits and women being in a part of democracy and all that also changed. So when you study econometrics that way and you sort of put data together, then can causal evidence be established at an econometric level? But at a general conversation level, like how does this make sense?
Mm.
So these are just my two questions, sir.
So Renu, are you an undergrad student?
No, sir. I'm I'm just associated with Economiga.
Okay, okay. No, very interesting. No, as I just said that these inclusive institutions were hardly inclusive, right? You have all these cases of violence in Australia, New Zealand, United States, whichever are inclusive institutions, so called, and obviously they were very very they were butcherous in how they went around killing the local population. But you see, uh, I'm not sure how much that criticism applies to AJR. I mean, they are simply giving you a framework. Like all economists do, we have limitations. They are not saying anywhere that my answer is the answer. Uh, we understand that we want to explain this puzzle of divergences. And one way to do this is to look at a deep dive into historical analysis and point out to this inclusive versus extractive. And obviously, I mean, they've been silent about the role of colonizers, but they are not really trying to explain in their research what colonizers, what kind of violence they did. They are simply trying to say that, compared to some countries, there was better rule of law, better economic institutions, which leads to economic performance today. And obviously, every research, every Nobel Prize since 68, 69 has been deeply criticized. And people are always talking about scrapping the economics Nobel Prize because of the fact that there are so many counterclaims where, one doesn't know whether this is the eternal truth. So, uh, I mean, but I mean, at the end of the day, that's how economics discipline is. We have a lot of answers, a lot of answers where the Chinese scholar or the African scholar. In fact, African scholars have also written about the fact that, why are they getting a prize for explaining extractive institutions? They don't know what happened to us, and instead, a Nobel Prize should be given to African scholars who have understood what true extractive institutions are and how much problems colonizers did and ruined Africa forever. But then, that's the nature of these prizes. Uh, it's not as if the AJR went around and sought the prize. The Nobel Committee gave them the prize, and we have to, deal with it if we believe in Nobel prizes. Uh, and your second question was about democracy. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, we have to go back to Ambedkar's great speech when he gave us the constitution, where he says that simply saying that, we are a democracy, etc., will not really serve us. We have to make sure that all of us are working constantly, because democracy is not just about voting, which unfortunately it has been reduced to in India and also all around the world. I mean, but not really looking at the larger institutions, larger judiciary, larger local institutions. Everything is important, and constantly holding the government accountable, the role of the media, and all those things are under big question today, especially today. So that's where I think this prize is, even though it leads to controversies, this prize is relevant because of the state of democracy all around the world. It's declining. We are going back to 1920s, where democracies all around the world collapsed, leading to all kinds of fascist and dictatorial movements. And we are seeing some of that happening all around us. So, I mean, I'm fully sympathetic to what you're saying, Renu. I have unfortunately no answers because, uh, I mean, one has to be an activist on these matters and constantly point out that democracy is not just about elections, and by just saying that you're democracy and you become a democracy, that doesn't happen. For it to function, for it to be uh, for it to be people oriented project, people have to be constantly involved and constantly debate and question the powers, because otherwise we are back to autocracy and back to dictatorships, which we are seeing in several countries. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. So, as we wrap up this enlightening session, it is my pleasure to take the responsibility to express the gratitude to everyone who actually made this webinar possible. First of all, like a big thank you to our incredible speaker, Dr. Agrawal sir. So, again, I had a lot of questions, but I am restraining to that because of the time constraint. I am sure I'll just connect with you
I'm
personally,
sorry for
sir.
that. You
Yeah,
can send
that's
me
not
your
a problem.
questions or over email.
Yeah, sure, sir. And again, I like the examples and the Harry Potter connection you made also. I'm sure that many of the audience also connected to it very well. Yeah, so a big thank you, sir, for sparing your time for this webinar. Second, I would like to express my gratitude to the Christ University, the Pune Lavasa Campus, and especially Dr. Tini for her support in making this webinar a reality. And then I cannot move away without thanking the Economiga team who actually did the operations part and worked to bring in some of the youngsters who wanted to discuss the Nobel Prize of 2024. So a big thank to our team for playing a part in making our greater objective of getting economics to the normal crowd possible. And again, this webinar wasn't possible without you guys, the participants. So thank you again for being here and sparing your time for the webinar. So again, a big thank you to everyone.